me like that. You are fired.
Please, I can explain.
The glass sang first, a soft ring as crystal met china, and then the word fell like a hammer. Nothing. It hung over linen and gold cutlery, over cameras that waited like patient eyes. The billionaire CEO did not raise his voice. He looked at the black waitress as if she were a shadow crossing his light. Around him sat investors who wrote numbers that moved cities. The room did not breathe. Air hummed. A candle burned with a steady blue core, the flame thin as a scalpel. The waitress steadied the tray. A glass trembled. A bead of water slid down, marked the cloth, and vanished into white. He had said it because soup was 3 minutes late. He had said it because he liked the feel of a line under his power. The word did not describe her. It measured him. Investors shifted, a ripple of leather and caution. One mapped the exits. Another studied the ceiling speakers. The PR director smiled at the table. A fixed smile that begged the world to rewind 10 seconds and spare her job. The waitress did not flinch. She squared her heels on the carpet's hidden grid. Her uniform held the scent of starch and citrus. A small pin sat on her collar. A silver circle with the hotel's emblem. A lighthouse. It caught the chandelier's light and threw it back in a tiny flash. A small thing, but steady. A point that refused to dim. "Continue," the CEO said, waving a hand as if clearing smoke. He reached for his glass. His cufflink, a diamond knot, found the same light as the lighthouse pin. 2 sparks in the same second, but not the same meaning. Silence tried to heal itself with ordinary noises. Water poured. A chair leg sighed. Far away, a service elevator rang and closed with a tired clank. No one at the main table moved first. The insult sat like a stone in clear water, and the ripples kept traveling. Years back, the CEO learned that people obey the one who speaks last. He saved final words like coins and spent them to buy rooms. Tonight he spent one to crush a person he did not need. He did not see the investors study the stain, then the pin, then each other. The waitress shifted the tray and stepped away, not fast, not slow. Her face stayed calm, but her shoulders set. She had a mother who taught children to read, a father who checked bridges for cracks, a brother who fixed neon along the pier. She knew the weight of names and the danger of careless ones. She kept this job not by lowering her head, but by lifting her standard. At the end of the hall, contract binders waited in a black case. Billions in print, polite clauses like glass fences. The insult walked toward those binders faster than any courier. It carried no signature, yet it marked every page. A camera on a discreet tripod had been set to capture candids for the company feed. Its red light blinked. Someone at the media table reached forward and pressed a button. The candle did not flicker. It burned as if measuring time in surgical seconds. The word still hung there, invisible but heavy, and the room began to tilt around it. A throat cleared. A chair moved back 1 inch. The PR director looked to the partners, then to the door. The legal officer opened a folder and closed it again. Someone inhaled to speak. The deal began to listen. The man who had spoken the word wore his confidence like armor. To the world, he was not simply a CEO. He was a brand, a living emblem of triumph. His name opened doors in every capital. His empire stretched across continents. Airlines, hotels, tech firms, and luxury goods. He sold an image of vision and certainty, and people bought it because they feared missing their chance to stand beside power. He built this mask carefully. In magazines, he appeared framed by skylines. At charity galas, he gave checks large enough to rewrite headlines. His speeches spoke of merit and innovation, but the message was always the same. He was untouchable. The mask never cracked in public. Cameras caught a smile that seemed generous, and investors leaned closer, convinced his hand alone could multiply their fortunes. Behind closed doors, the air was different. The mask did not shine here. He demanded silence at the dinner table, as if conversation itself could weaken his rule. Assistants walked on edge, memorizing the pitch of his voice, knowing that a single hesitation could cost them their place. His office, built of glass and steel, stood like a fortress above the city. From there he watched traffic crawl, believing the world itself moved under his command. The contrast was sharp. On one side, a man celebrated as a symbol of progress. On the other, a figure who used arrogance like a weapon. He fed on control. His watch was not for time but for dominance. Its ticking hands reminded him he could buy seconds and sell hours. The private jet he favored was less a machine than a throne, its leather seats carrying the scent of power. He never traveled alone. There was always an entourage, a line of figures who repeated his words and reflected his certainty back to him. What kept his empire running was not only money, but fear. Partners feared losing access. Workers feared being dismissed with a gesture. Even friends feared being replaced by the next loyal face. He wore the mask so long that many forgot it was not his skin. Yet symbols tell the truth, even when words do not. At the banquet, the waitress's small lighthouse pin had reflected the chandelier's light. For a second, it rivaled the diamond on his cufflink. The contrast was quiet but undeniable. One object stood for guidance, the other for vanity. One for service, the other for possession. He believed power was permanent because he controlled the script. But power that rests on fear is brittle. The insult he threw so casually had begun to travel through corridors he could not command. Investors remembered not the man on magazine covers, but the one who bent dignity into a weapon. The mask still held its shine under the lights, but cracks had formed beneath it. And in those cracks, the empire's true weight began to show. The banquet was not over. Neither was the deal. But in that silence, the question rose. How long can a mask stay on before it breaks? The insult struck like a thrown stone, but she did not shatter. The black waitress stood with her tray balanced, her face calm, her eyes steady. In the silence that followed the CEO's word, she seemed carved from something stronger than the moment. Where others shifted and lowered their gaze, she held her ground. Her silence was not weakness. It was discipline. Her name was Maya. She had worked in the hotel for 4 years, each day stitched with quiet endurance. To guests, she was part of the backdrop, present, useful, invisible. Yet to her family, she was the pillar that kept a small household upright. Her wages covered her mother's medicine, her younger sister's college fees, and the rent for an apartment that smelled faintly of fresh bread and lavender soap. Every plate she carried was a promise kept. Her uniform was simple: black dress, white collar, silver pin. To others it marked her as service. To her it was armor. The pressed fabric held dignity, the kind her parents had taught her. Respect begins with how you carry yourself, not how others treat you. Each shift, she ironed the dress with care. Each morning, she polished the pin until it caught light like a star. The lighthouse etched on its surface was more than a hotel emblem. To Maya, it was a reminder. Storms pass, but the light must stand. This night, the storm came in the form of a man who believed wealth was power without limit. When he called her nothing, she could feel the weight of eyes press upon her, measuring whether she would bow or falter. She chose neither. She did not answer with anger, nor did she let the insult bend her posture. She breathed, centered herself, and moved with calm hands. In that stillness, she spoke louder than any reply could. Her story carried quiet resilience. Years earlier, her father had lost work when the steel plant closed. Neighbors moved away. Friends scattered. But Maya stayed. She found the hotel job, one many overlooked as unimportant, and she treated it with reverence. She believed that labor done with integrity gave life its meaning. While others saw trays, she saw trust. While others saw silence, she saw strength. At the banquet, her silence grew heavier than the chandelier above. Investors noticed it. Some avoided her eyes, unsettled by the dignity she held in the face of insult. Others stared, caught by the contrast. A man with billions acting small and a woman with little refusing to shrink. The tray she held became a symbol. It trembled slightly under the weight of crystal glasses, yet her arms did not yield. It was as though she carried not drinks but the balance of the room itself. The word nothing was meant to erase her, but the steadiness of her hands wrote her presence deeper into the scene. In that instant, she became more than an employee. She became the silent conscience of the room. Her restraint forced everyone else to confront the truth. The insult revealed more about the speaker than the target. The deal papers waited in their case, billions poised for signature. Yet it was Maya's quiet endurance that framed the moment, not the figures on the page. She was unseen until the insult, and then unforgettable after it. She turned, carrying the tray away with measured steps. The lighthouse pin caught the light again, sharp and unwavering. The room remained tense, but she did not bend to it. Maya did not need to speak to prove her worth. Her silence had already said everything. The insult did not end when the CEO spoke it. It began its second life in the silence of those who heard it. Around the long table, investors shifted in their chairs. Some pretended to study their notes. Others stared at the crystal glasses as if answers could be read in water. They had gathered to close a deal worth billions, yet now they sat frozen, each weighing the cost of a single word. At the far end, one investor adjusted his tie. He had built factories that employed thousands, yet in that instant he could not find the courage to lift his voice. His eyes flicked to the waitress, then quickly away. He told himself the insult was only a slip, but the knot in his throat refused to ease. Across from him, a woman who managed a major pension fund pressed her pen so hard against the paper that the ink bled through. She had endured boardrooms where arrogance was common, but this struck her differently. It was not careless, it was cruel. She thought of the workers whose savings she represented. Could she tie their future to a man who dismissed another human as nothing? The staff along the walls stood stiff as statues. Some had learned long ago that survival meant silence. They knew the rules: look useful, not visible. Be present, not personal. Yet tonight their discipline wavered. The insult hung heavier than the chandeliers above. A young server near the door swallowed hard, her knuckles pale around the jug she carried. Bystanders who were not part of the deal, media assistants, hotel managers, junior aides, felt the same unease. They glanced at each other, quick and nervous, as if confirming that they had heard what they wished they had not. No one moved first because to act was to risk. But the silence was not safety, it was complicity. The words spread like a crack through glass. At first invisible, then suddenly sharp, threatening to split the whole pane. Investors felt it in their bones. The room had been crafted to display confidence. Golden light, velvet drapes, polished wood. Yet now every surface reflected a question none dared ask aloud. Was this the man they trusted with their reputations, their money, their names? One legal advisor opened a folder, closed it, then opened it again. He thought of the clauses on ethics buried in the deal. He thought of reporters waiting outside, hungry for a headline. He thought of the tape that might exist, the one with the red blinking light he had noticed at the back of the hall. The tension grew sharper. The clinking of cutlery stopped. Even the candles seemed taller, their flames unbending as if bearing witness too. Every second of silence added weight to the insult. It was no longer a private remark. It was a public mark. The investors were not naive. They had overlooked arrogance before. They had excused pride if profit followed. But this moment felt different. It was not strategy, not calculation. It was contempt, naked and unguarded. The kind of contempt that could spread from one word to a brand, from a brand to a deal, from a deal to every shareholder watching. The waitress had walked away with steady steps, but her silence had not erased the moment. It had magnified it. In her calm, the arrogance of the insult stood out sharper. Around the table, men and women who dealt daily in billions now wrestled with a truth they could not ignore. A fortune could be measured on paper. Integrity could not. And in that room, integrity had just been tested and found missing. The insult had fallen in seconds, but the deal on the table had been years in the making. In a black leather case near the head of the banquet hall lay the documents. Inside, hundreds of pages waited, their fine print binding together industries across borders, airlines, shipping, digital infrastructure, and global supply chains. One signature would merge them under the CEO's empire. The value was staggering, over $40 billion. For him, it was not just money. It was immortality in the world of business. The setup had been carefully staged. Investors from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East sat at the same table drawn by profit and prestige. Governments had whispered their approval. Banks had opened their vaults. The CEO had positioned himself as the man who could connect east to west, north to south, with his empire as the bridge. The banquet was to be a celebration disguised as dinner, but then came the word. A single insult, aimed at someone who held no financial power, suddenly shifted the weight of everything. For the investors, the contrast was stark. On the papers, numbers danced in the trillions of future revenue. In the air, one word now clung like smoke, heavy and toxic. Could they bind their names to his when his own tongue had betrayed him? One investor from Europe, known for caution, thought of the workers who would build the factories. If this man dismissed a waitress as nothing, how would he treat entire communities tied to his projects? Another investor from Asia recalled the cultural clauses in the deal about respect and harmony. Those clauses were meant as symbols of trust. Tonight, they had already been broken. The staff sensed the shift. Waiters moved slower, quieter, aware they were serving not just food but the fragile veneer of civility. Every tray became a reminder of the line that had been crossed. The lighthouse pins on their collars shone faintly, small but unyielding, in contrast to the CEO's diamond cufflinks, which now seemed to catch too much light, almost mocking in their brilliance. The rising conflict spread through whispers. One legal advisor leaned to his partner, voice low but urgent. "Do we risk reputational damage?" Another quietly tapped his phone under the table, sending a message to his team outside. The PR director tried to smile, but sweat gathered at her temple. She knew the reporters would not write about the soup or the speeches. They would write about the word. At the center, the CEO remained confident, or at least pretended so. He lifted his glass, certain that billions could silence doubt. He had always believed money repaired everything, yet he missed the detail that mattered most. For the investors, this was no longer just about money. It was about judgment. It was about the character of the man who would lead them. The climax of the evening arrived not with applause, but with hesitation. The contracts should have been signed that night. Instead, pens stayed capped. Eyes avoided his. The silence, once his weapon, had turned against him. The insult echoed in it, louder with every unspoken second. The contrast was complete. On the table lay billions in profit. In the air lay a single word of contempt. The balance tilted, not toward the papers but toward the silence. And in that silence, the investors began to wonder, was their fortune safer without him? The empire did not collapse with noise. It began to crack in whispers. The word nothing still lingered in the air long after the waitress had walked away. Investors sat stiff in their chairs, eyes lowered but minds racing. They replayed the scene again and again, each repetition cutting deeper. What had seemed like a small insult now carried the weight of judgment. It was not simply a slip of the tongue. It was a mirror of the man they were about to trust with billions. At the side of the hall, two lawyers leaned close. Their voices were hushed, but their faces told the story. "Clause 14, ethics and conduct," one muttered. The other nodded, tapping his folder nervously. A contract worth billions suddenly looked fragile, its ink not yet dry but already stained. The PR director felt her throat tighten. She had built campaigns to polish his image. Ads of charity donations, photographs of him shaking hands with children, speeches about equality. But one word had undone it all. She pictured tomorrow's headlines. They would not show balance sheets or merger charts. They would show a billionaire dismissing a woman with quiet dignity. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Damage control had to begin before the cameras outside caught a hint of the truth. The whispers spread like cracks across glass. One investor whispered to another, "If he speaks this way in public, what does he say in private?" Another answered with silence, his expression enough. A banker from Dubai pressed his lips together, already calculating the cost of withdrawal. A European fund manager glanced at the exit, her decision forming faster than the wine in her glass could settle. The arrogance that once looked like confidence now looked like danger. His posture, straight and proud, no longer inspired trust. It threatened it. Every detail of his behavior was suddenly reinterpreted. The way he snapped his fingers at assistants, the way he dominated every toast, the way his cufflinks glittered too brightly under the chandelier. What had once seemed like strength now felt like weakness dressed as power. The symbolic contrast haunted the room. The waitress's lighthouse pin, steady, modest, reflected light with quiet strength. The CEO's diamond cufflink reflected the same light, but in a sharp, blinding flash. One symbol guided, the other blinded. The investors had seen both. They could not unsee them. The rising conflict was silent but decisive. Contracts were no longer about profit. They were about risk, and reputation was a risk no investor could afford. Billion-dollar empires could survive market crashes, but they rarely survived moral scandals. The climax came not with a bang, but with stillness. The CEO raised his glass again as if nothing had happened. He smiled, certain that the room was still his. But no glasses rose to meet his. The toast died in his hand. In that frozen second, the room revealed its verdict. He had spoken the wrong word at the wrong time, and now the wrong people were listening. The closure was clear. Power built on fear and arrogance had started to crumble under its own weight. The deal was not yet dead, but the first cracks were visible and everyone could see them. And in those cracks, the empire's downfall had already begun. The fall of an empire did not come with fire or thunder. It came with silence, and then the sound of pens refusing to move. The contracts lay open on the banquet table, their pages thick with promises of billions. For weeks the deal had been certain. Banks had cleared funds. Governments had nodded approval. Investors had flown across oceans to sign their names. Tonight was meant to be a coronation. Instead, it became an execution. The first break was quiet. The European pension fund manager pushed her chair back and folded her hands. "We will need to reconsider reputational implications," she said softly. Her words were polite, but they carried the weight of a verdict. Others nodded, some too quickly. The room felt it. One departure could spread like fire through dry grass. A partner from Asia tapped his phone under the table. A moment later, his aide entered and whispered in his ear. He cleared his throat. "Our board advises delay," he announced. Delay was a mask for retreat. Everyone knew it. The CEO forced a smile. He leaned forward, voice firm. "This is noise. A distraction. Billions are at stake. Let us not lose focus." But the more he spoke, the more his power shrank. His tone, once commanding, now sounded desperate. Investors avoided his eyes. They stared at the papers instead, as if the ink itself had turned toxic. Each remembered the moment, the waitress, the word, the silence that followed. They had come for profit, but they could not escape conscience. Profit was numbers. Reputation was oxygen. Without it, no empire breathed. The PR director's phone buzzed again and again. Headlines were already spreading outside. One leaked video clip had captured the insult. It was only 12 seconds long, but it was enough. 12 seconds had broken through 40 years of empire building. The rising conflict became visible. One by one, investors spoke of concerns, reviews, and risks. Each phrase was a blade cutting through the deal. Lawyers closed folders without comment. A banker whispered to his colleague, "It's over." The chandelier above still shone, but its light now felt harsh, as if exposing every crack in the empire's face. The climax arrived when the largest partner, representing a Middle Eastern sovereign fund, stood. His words were measured, his tone calm. "We cannot proceed under these circumstances." Chairs shifted, hearts sank, and the deal collapsed in that single breath. Billions vanished not into the markets, but into silence. The CEO sat frozen. His diamond cufflinks caught the light, but their brilliance mocked him now. He had built a life where money fixed everything, but money could not repair dignity once destroyed. The insult had not only targeted the waitress, it had infected the entire room. His empire was not undone by competitors, lawsuits, or markets. It was undone by his own tongue. The closure was brutal in its simplicity. Documents were gathered, pens capped, chairs pushed back. The investors walked out one by one, their footsteps echoing like verdicts. The leather case that once held the deal's promise now looked like a coffin for his ambition. The billionaire remained seated, glass in hand, but the toast he had prepared would never be raised. He stared at the empty chairs, the silence heavier than gold. And in that silence, he learned the truth. An empire can be lost not in years, but in seconds, through a single word spoken with arrogance. The empire had fallen silent, but silence did not mean the story was finished. As investors filed out and papers were closed, one figure remained steady in the background. Maya, the waitress, stood near the door. She had carried trays, endured the insult, and walked away without breaking. Until now, she had let her silence speak for her. But silence, though powerful, was not the end. The CEO still sat at the table, his glass untouched, his cufflinks gleaming like fragile shields. Around him, the wreckage of the evening was clear. Empty chairs, folded contracts, and a deal worth billions slipping into the dark. He tried to look unbothered, but his jaw was tight, his breath shallow. Power had abandoned him, and he knew it. Maya stepped forward. Her shoes made no sound on the carpet, but her presence drew every eye left in the room. Staff paused, unsure if she should speak, but she did not ask permission. Her dignity was her permission. She placed the tray down and lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, low, and precise. "You called me nothing," she said. "But nothing does not carry families. Nothing does not serve meals night after night. Nothing does not pay rent or buy medicine or help a sister study. I am not nothing. I am work, I am dignity. And tonight I am the reminder that words reveal more about the one who speaks than the one who receives them. The words cut sharper than the insult ever had. Not because they were loud, but because they were measured." She did not accuse. She did not rage. She spoke as one who understood her worth, a worth that no empire could diminish. The CEO's eyes flickered. For years no one had spoken to him this way. People had bowed, agreed, and excused him. But this young woman, whose name he had not cared to know, now stood taller than him without leaving the ground. A few investors who had lingered near the door turned back. They listened in silence. In Maya's words, they heard not only a reply to the insult, but also a reflection of their own hesitation. She had said aloud what they had been too cautious to voice. Arrogance cannot buy respect, and power without respect is already broken. Symbolism filled the room. The lighthouse pin on her collar caught the last light from the chandelier. Steady and clear. The CEO's cufflinks glittered too, but their shine looked hollow, like mirrors reflecting only themselves. The contrast was complete. One symbol guided, the other blinded. The rising conflict ended in this contrast of voices. His had been careless, sharp with contempt. Hers was steady, rooted in truth. The weight of her words shifted the balance of the entire evening. The deal had collapsed because of him. The moral judgment was sealed because of her. The climax was not shouted. It was her final sentence. Respect is the only currency that never loses value. Tonight you spent yours. The closure came with stillness. She picked up the tray again and walked toward the door, her steps measured, her head unbowed. She left behind no anger, only clarity. Those who heard her knew the story of the night was no longer about billions lost. It was about a single voice that restored dignity in the face of arrogance. The waitress had been called nothing. Yet in the end, her words became everything. The word that was meant to erase another life became the word that erased his own empire. The banquet hall stood empty now. Chairs had been pushed back in neat but abandoned rows. The leather case once filled with contracts sat shut, untouched like a coffin for ambitions that would never rise again. The CEO remained seated long after the last investor had left. His glass of wine, once raised to seal a deal, was half full, its surface unmoving. The silence of the room was no longer his weapon. It was his sentence. For decades he had shaped the image of a man who could not fall. His empire had survived lawsuits, recessions, even political storms. But what no one had predicted, what he had never imagined, was that one word could bring it all down. Not a market crash, not a hostile takeover, not a government ban. Just one careless word, spoken with arrogance in front of the wrong witnesses. The setup for his collapse had been invisible, built over years of unchecked pride. Every assistant who bowed, every partner who excused his behavior, every magazine that praised him as untouchable, each one laid a stone in the wall of illusion. But walls made of illusion crack when pressed by truth. The truth that night came not from markets or numbers. It came from a young woman who refused to break. Outside the banquet hall, the news had already spread. Headlines carried 12 seconds of video. In them, the CEO's face was sharp with disdain, and his words struck like a blow. The clip was shared millions of times before he left the building. Stock values dipped overnight. Partners released statements of deep concern. By morning, his empire looked less like steel and more like glass. The rising conflict unfolded as he tried to contain the fire. He summoned his PR team, demanded they rewrite the narrative, threatened lawsuits against media outlets. But the more he fought, the more the story grew. The public no longer cared about his billions. They cared about his arrogance. In cafes, Workers watched the clip on phones and shook their heads. In offices, board members whispered about exit strategies. In schools, teachers replayed the waitress's words as lessons in dignity. The climax came quickly. Within a week, his largest partners withdrew completely. Deals collapsed. Banks froze lines of credit. A board meeting, once his kingdom, turned into a trial. His own directors asked whether he could still lead. He had always believed money could silence doubt, but now even money refused to listen. His empire crumbled not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked respect. The waitress, Maya, returned to her life without ceremony. She woke early the next morning, as she always did. She ironed her uniform, polished her pin, and walked to work with steady steps. The world now knew her name, but she did not chase headlines. For her, dignity was not new, it was her constant. She served guests with the same care. But now, when her eyes met theirs, something unspoken passed between them. They had seen her stand, silent then strong, and they recognized her for what she was, unbreakable. Symbolism lingered everywhere. The lighthouse pin on her collar still caught the light, steady and true. It guided her through storms of arrogance without flickering. The CEO's diamond cufflinks, once symbols of power, were now relics of vanity. They had reflected only themselves, and in the end, they reflected his fall. The contrast was sharp and final. He, the man who thought himself everything, was left isolated, stripped of trust and reputation. She, the woman he called nothing, became the anchor of the story, her presence shining brighter than billions on paper. The irony was complete. The weight of nothing had proven heavier than the weight of his fortune. The closure was not loud. It did not need to be. Maya carried on, her life rooted in steady work, her dignity intact. The CEO remained in silence, surrounded by wealth that no longer answered to him. One was lifted by truth, the other buried by arrogance. In the end, the moral was undeniable. Empires built on fear collapse. Respect endures. And so the man who called her nothing lost everything, while the woman he dismissed stood as the true measure of worth.